Okay, so last night, as you all were just going about your post-Thanksgiving Saturday night recovery, maybe scrolling through Twitter or X, Donald Trump announced his plans to nominate Kash Patel to be the director of the FBI. Now, this is notable and also alarming, which I will get into for a whole host of reasons, all of which we're going to delve into with a variety of people today. First of all, the job isn't even open, so let's start there. Christopher Wray, who Trump himself appointed, still has a few years left on his 10-year term, which started when Trump fired James Comey. Remember that? So Trump is going to have to fire Wray once he's inaugurated in order to get Patel in. Second of all, Kash Patel's only real qualification appears to be that he is very loyal to Donald Trump. In a moment, I'm going to talk to Elena Platt-Calabro, who is a staff writer for The Atlantic. And back in August, she wrote what is kind of the definitive profile of Kash Patel. And here's how she described him. Patel appeared singularly focused on pleasing Trump, even in an administration full of loyalists. Patel was exceptional in his devotion. So that is the guy Trump wants to lead the nation's top law enforcement agency, which isn't typically a political agency, by the way. And after a campaign that was laser focused on revenge and retribution, I think you probably know why. Now, Kash Patel is also known as an extremely conspiratorial thinker. He's peddled anti-vaccine diet supplements, which are supposed to reverse the effects of COVID vaccines. And just for the record, that is not a thing at all in the scientific community. He's also repeatedly praised QAnon, once saying, quote, "There's a lot of good to a lot of it. Q has been so right on so many things." Have they been right on so many things, Kash Patel? I'm not sure about that. But let's back up for just a second, because I think it's important to really understand how a guy like that arrived at this point. And his journey into Trump world really began on the House Intelligence Committee in many ways, where he worked for Devin Nunes. Remember that guy? We can see him there. Well, Patel started working for him at the height of the Russia investigation, and that work basically revolved around attempting to undercut and discredit that investigation in any way that he could. Kash Patel was so proud of the job he did that he even wrote a children's book about it.
We are living in unparalleled times of corruption in both our media and government. It is our job to expose the truth, no matter what the cost. My name is Kash Patel, and I have written the first ever children's Russiagate book. It's called The Plot Against the King. It is a fantastical telling by me, the Russiagate chief investigator under then Chairman Nunes, of how we triumphed to put truth over evil and report the facts to the American public. Please go to the link below and order your copy today.
The first ever children's Russiagate book, everyone. What a demand. There's still time for holiday shopping, guys. Get out there today. And after his work on the Intel Committee, though, Devin Nunes fulfilled a promise that he'd made to Patel by reportedly hounding members of the Trump administration to hire Patel. Patel writes in his own book, quote, "Devin, true to his word, spoke with the president and told him that I had saved his presidency by revealing the unprecedented political hit job designed to take him down. When President Trump learned who I was and what I did, he told his chief of staff to hire me immediately into the National Security Council." That's quite a humble brag in there. And that's not exactly how he ended up in the White House, but regardless, he did get hired. Once he got in there, Patel's tenure really seemed to be defined by two major dynamics. I mean, that blind loyalty to Trump that I already mentioned, and a near universal alarm by his colleagues about his access to power. Former administration officials told Elena Platt-Calabro that from his first days as a staffer on the National Security Council in February of 2019, Patel was fixated on trying to get FaceTime with Trump. He had a script, and it wasn't long before many of his colleagues could literally recite it themselves. Went like this: "Mr. President, the deep state is out to get you," as the longtime Trump advisor paraphrased it, "and I'm going to save you from it." So it's really no wonder that as Trump was losing his grip on power after the 2020 election, he tried to install Kash Patel in some very important jobs. First, he tried to make him deputy FBI director, which then Attorney General Bill Barr told then Chief of Staff Mark Meadows would happen, quote, "over my dead body." In his memoir, Barr also said Trump's desire to put him in that job showed a, quote, "shocking detachment from reality." When that effort failed, Trump tried to move him into a top job at the CIA, at which point then CIA Director Gina Haspel threatened to resign if they went through with it. Elena Platt-Calabro writes, quote, this was what seemed to disturb many of his colleagues the most. Patel was dangerous, several of them told me. not because of a certain plan he would be poised to carry out if given control of the CIA or FBI, but because he appeared to have no plan at all. His priorities today always subject to a mercurial president's wishes tomorrow. What wouldn't a person like that do if asked? Well, we might be about to find out. And Kash Patel has previewed his plans, in his own words, many, many times.
The one thing we learned in the Trump administration the first go around is we got to put in all America patriots top to bottom. We will go out and find the conspirators, not just in government, but in the media. Yes, we're going to come after the people in the media who lied about American citizens, who helped Joe Biden rig presidential elections. We're going to come after you. Whether it's criminally or civilly, we'll figure that out. But yeah, we're putting you all on notice. And Steve, this is why they hate us. This is why we're tyrannical. This is why we're dictators, because we're actually going to use the Constitution to prosecute them for crimes they said we have always been guilty of, but never have.
Well, that right there is Kash Patel in a bit of a nutshell. And in her piece over the summer, Elena wrote that this about Donald Trump. Should he return to the White House, there will be no Millys, Haspels, or even Barrs to restrain him as he seeks revenge against his political enemies. Instead, there will be Patels, those whose true faith and allegiance belong not to a nation, but to one man. Joining me now is staff writer for The Atlantic, Elena Platt-Calabro, who wrote this piece, which is such an excellent piece if people are trying to get up to speed on who this guy is and why it matters. So let me just start by asking you, I tried to kind of delve into a lot of the pieces that are so interesting, and we'll delve into more, but is there anything from your reporting that I missed there that people should really understand as they're learning more about Kash Patel?
So I don't think you missed anything necessarily, but I'd love to expand on the piece about kind of in some ways the difference between Kash Patel and a lot of other people who have featured in the Trump White House over the years. One person I like to compare him with often is Stephen Miller, who has been kind of Trump's immigration top aide for, his first administration. We know he will be in the second administration. The thing about Stephen Miller is he's an ideologue. He is someone who has a very specific vision for how immigration should and shouldn't work in this country. What I found fascinating about Kash Patel is he is not an ideologue as traditionally understood. Really, what motivates him and has motivated him from the time that he became a National Security Council staffer in 2019 is just wanting to please Trump, just wanting to kind of better his standing before Donald Trump, which is to say that if one day Donald Trump wants to do something that, really tacks far right, he will be there. If for some reason the next day he wants to do the inverse, Kash Patel will be the biggest cheerleader for that. So I think when I talk to people who, and this, by the way, people in Trump's orbit who were alarmed about the possibility that he could have a really senior post in this administration, it was not, I'm nervous about the fact that he will do X, Y, Z. It's, we have no idea what he might want to do in this job because it is all contingent on what Donald Trump might decide that morning. Which is quite something and important for people to understand. Now, you talked to so many people for this piece. This news just came out last night. Have you heard from any of these people who reached out to you since the news broke last night? I talked to one former administration official who worked closely with Kash Patel, and we were talking about how, in the course of my reporting the story, it's clear at this point that Trump really values Kash Patel's loyalty. At the same time, there was thought to be, kind of a sober sense in that circle that Kash Patel would never get confirmed. So the idea of appointing him CIA director, nominating him for a position like this, was always seen as a little bit, maybe, not within the cards, but deputy FBI director, for example. But I think we've already seen, too, that Donald Trump is not going to be shy about slotting people into an acting capacity in a lot of these positions if for whatever reason he can't get the Senate to confirm them. And so the person I was talking to last night was saying, even if the Senate comes out and says, we don't have the votes for this, you're very likely to possibly see Kash Patel as acting director of the FBI. And what do people make and what do you make of the purpose of that? I mean, what is Trump trying to get out of that 200 days, I think, is the amount of time he can serve? So one thing I went back to a lot last night, I went and re-listened to a podcast that Donald Trump Jr. had done, where he talked about, this was pre-election, he said, one thing that might be great to do is when we get into office to placed people like Kash Patel in an acting capacity in these major positions as a shot across the bow to the DC establishment, the media establishment. And as you showed on your clip just then, he sat down with Steve Bannon and really laid out what he would want to do in a position like that, whether it was the FBI or acting attorney general or acting CIA director, which is to say, go after the people who he feels have wronged not just Trump, and this is important, but himself in the course of his work in the White House. Kash Patel, I found, is somebody who's very much driven by resentment against the elites, but is also trying to balance that with an abiding desire to be seen as one. And so his feeling is that he was mercilessly and unfairly attacked for his work with Devin Nunes. And that, I think, has been a fuel for him throughout his rise in his career. And we could very well see the manifestation of that in terms of, what revenge he wants to exact upon which groups of people when he takes this job.
One of the things that was so memorable about your piece is that you really lay out this pattern of lying. And maybe it's about him trying to fit in. I mean, he lied about his background and where he grew up. He lied about his role in the Benghazi hearings and the investigations. What do you make of that, and what should people understand about that pattern?
I think that when I spoke to people who worked with Kash Patel back in his days as a public defender, so well before he came to Washington, they kind of go back to saying a lot of what they felt drove him was insecurity to a degree. He was working around a lot of people who had gone to Ivy League law schools. He did not go to an Ivy League law school. And despite the fact that no one around him really cared about that necessarily or saw him as any lesser for that, I think he sort of internalized the idea that he should be trying to prove himself constantly. And the way that I think that's taken shape as he's gotten closer to Donald Trump, you mentioned the fact about, I guess lying is the right word about where he grew up. It's one of the first things I learned in my reporting. He would go on these podcasts often and say, Donald Trump and I were a lot alike because we're just a couple of guys from Queens. And that was sort of a moment where I had to pause and be, you grew up in Garden City, which for those who don't know is a pretty Tony suburb in Long Island. And so that discrepancy, which he, by the way, did not dispute in our fact-checking process, to me was emblematic of just, shaping his background to whatever extent might endear him to Trump a bit more, or just make him seem like one of the, foremost proponents of the MAGA ideology.